What happens when a government under decades of sanctions says it is ready to talk, but only if the pressure stops first, while the world's most powerful country insists that pressure is the leverage? Today, Cuba sits at that crossroads, facing power outages across entire regions, a collapsing economy, and renewed threats from Washington that could redefine the balance of power in the Caribbean. If this moment escalates, Cuba could face a deeper economic blockade and prolonged instability. If it fails, a rare diplomatic opening may close for years, and if it succeeds, it could mark the most consequential shift in US-Cuba relations since the Cold War. The stakes extend beyond Havana, affecting energy flows, regional migration, and the influence of global powers already repositioning around the crisis. To understand why this matters now, you have to step back into the long arc of US-Cuba relations. Since the 1959 revolution that brought Fidel Castro to power, Cuba has lived under varying degrees of American economic isolation. The embargo, first imposed in the early 1960s, hardened over decades into a comprehensive system targeting trade, finance, and energy access. For years, Cuba survived largely through external patrons, first the Soviet Union and later Venezuela, whose subsidized oil shipments helped keep the island's economy afloat. That support is now in question. In early January, US forces captured Venezuela's president Nicolás Maduro, removing Havana's most critical ally and triggering immediate geopolitical shockwaves. Within days, Washington escalated pressure on Cuba, signaling a strategy aimed at accelerating internal strain rather than gradual engagement. President Donald Trump framed Cuba as economically isolated and structurally weakened, suggesting that negotiations were already taking place at senior levels, even as Cuban officials publicly rejected talks under coercion. Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel responded with a carefully calibrated message. Standing beneath imagery tied to the revolution's origins, he acknowledged the scale of economic and informational pressure while signaling openness to dialogue on any subject, provided it occurred without threats or preconditions. The statement was not improvised. It was broadcast simultaneously across national television, radio, and digital platforms, indicating a coordinated effort to prepare the population for difficult months ahead while keeping diplomatic channels theoretically open. The pressure is measurable. In recent weeks, Trump signed an executive order threatening additional tariffs on countries supplying oil to Cuba, a move designed to choke energy imports without direct military involvement. He later claimed that Mexico had halted shipments in response, an assertion publicly denied by Mexico's president. At the same time, Reuters reported that a tanker previously used to transport Venezuelan fuel had loaded 150,000 barrels of gasoline, suggesting that emergency supply routes may still be forming, albeit under growing risk. Inside Cuba, the consequences are visible. Hyperinflation has sharply reduced the purchasing power of state wages and pensions. Reports from across the island describe rising street begging and food scavenging, conditions rarely acknowledged so openly in earlier years. Power outages have intensified, with the eastern region experiencing widespread blackouts that disrupted hospitals, communications, and transport. Government officials have begun signaling that further hardship is likely, framing upcoming measures as temporary but demanding significant public effort. At the same time, Havana is not isolated diplomatically. Díaz-Canel confirmed receiving messages of support from the presidents of China and Russia, emphasizing continued cooperation with both Cuba and Venezuela. These signals matter. They indicate that while the United States is attempting to tighten economic constraints, rival powers are watching closely, weighing whether deeper engagement with Cuba could serve their broader strategic interests in the Western Hemisphere. What if Washington doubles down instead of negotiating? In that scenario, energy shortages could worsen rapidly, accelerating migration flows toward the United States and neighboring countries. Regional governments would face humanitarian pressures, while Russia and China could expand their presence through financial lifelines, infrastructure deals, or energy assistance, turning Cuba into another front in global competition. But consider the alternative. What if quiet talks, rumored by business figures with long-standing ties to the Cuban state, mature into formal negotiations mediated through third countries such as Mexico? In that case, Cuba might accept limited economic reforms or monitoring mechanisms in exchange for sanctions relief, reshaping its internal political economy without a dramatic regime change. For Washington, such an outcome could stabilize the region while reducing the influence of rival powers close to U.S. shores. There is also a third possibility, less discussed but equally significant. What if dialogue begins but collapses midway due to domestic political pressures on both sides? In the United States, Cuba policy remains deeply polarized. In Cuba, leadership cannot appear to concede under pressure without risking internal legitimacy. A failed negotiation could harden positions further, leaving both sides worse off than before. The regional implications extend beyond Cuba itself. Caribbean energy markets, already strained, could face new volatility. Central American migration patterns could intensify. Latin American governments would be forced to recalibrate their relations with Washington, balancing economic dependence against domestic public opinion sympathetic to Cuba's predicament. Globally, the crisis tests whether sanctions remain an effective tool or whether they increasingly push states into alternative alliances. As this unfolds, the language on all sides matters. Cuban officials emphasize sovereignty and resistance while acknowledging the scale of economic pain. U.S. officials frame pressure as leverage for reform, even as humanitarian conditions deteriorate. External actors signal solidarity without committing to full economic substitution for lost Venezuelan support. Each move narrows or widens the path toward de-escalation. In the end, this moment is about more than Cuba or the United States. It is about how power is exercised in a world where economic tools can be as destabilizing as military ones, and where dialogue competes with coercion as a strategy for influence. Watch for signs not only of official talks, but of energy flows, migration data, and shifts in regional diplomacy. Those indicators will reveal whether this standoff becomes a turning point or another chapter in a conflict that never quite ends.